subjects believe that the world is as if it's suggested by the hypnotist. A surgical patient who's given a hypnotic suggestion for analgesia believes that he or she is not feeling pain. That's not acting as if, okay? And that doesn't mean that the pain stimulus isn't felt at some level in the patient's nervous system, but they do have this belief that the world is as suggested by the hypnotist, and it's this change in belief, kind of change in what the philosophers call intentionality, that really gets to the heart of hypnosis. Professor Spiegel's subject believes that there are helium balloons attached to his wrist and pulling his hand up. There aren't really, but that's the belief that he's got at the time. More recently, Ernest Hilgard, Spiegel's predecessor at Stanford, argued that what unites all the phenomena of hypnosis is a kind of division of consciousness that accounts for this belief that the world is as suggested by the hypnotist, by which Hilgard simply meant that by virtue of this division, subjects are unaware of sensations and percepts and memories and thoughts and feelings that nevertheless are sitting in their, working their way through their mental apparatus and affecting their behavior outside of experience, thought, and action. So a hypnotic subject, for example, who's given a suggestion for blindness, believes that he or she is blind, but still may be responding unconsciously to various kinds of visual stimuli in exactly the same way that hysterical patients do. One of the hallmarks of hysteria in the classic descriptions are paradoxes in behavior, so that a patient will come in and claim to be blind, and the physician will say, well, please would you sit over here, and the patient will move to the chair, right? So there is some kind of visual function going on here, but the patient still doesn't experience him or herself as seen. Quick question. Well, perhaps. Beliefs are important in placebo effects as well, but placebo effects don't necessarily have this dissociative quality that I'm really kind of talking about here. When physiological studies of placebo have been done, for example, it turns out that the body responds as if there's no pain stimulus there. But as you'll see in a minute, things are not quite that way with hypnosis. There is a kind of, well, I'll give the game away. What hypnotic suggestion does is to affect explicit expressions of perception and memory, leaving implicit expressions of perception and memory virtually intact. But not for everybody, okay? One of the cardinal features of hypnosis is that there are huge individual differences in responsiveness to hypnotic suggestions. There is a kind of normal distribution of hypnotizability, not unlike normal distributions of other kinds of cognitive and motoric skills. Most people are not particularly highly hypnotizable. The kinds of subjects that we tend to use in our experiments on hypnosis represent about 5 to 10% of an unselected sample of college students. How do we measure hypnotizability? We measure it by means of performance-based tests that look a little bit like intelligence tests, though they're not intelligence tests, they're tests of hypnotizability. You take a subject, put them in a chair, and you give them a hypnotic induction. You give them suggestions for relaxation, for focused attention, maybe for eye closure. Eventually they'll close their eyes, probably. And then you go on to give them various kinds of suggestions for various kinds of alterations in perception and memory and the cognitive and the voluntary control of action. And that you test the subject's response to each of these suggestions and evaluate the response according to certain kinds of behavioral criteria. So, for example, to return to the Spiegel experiment for a second, you might suggest to the subject that there's a helium balloon attached to his wrist and lifting his hand up, and the test is whether his hand really goes up. Does it go up a certain amount over a certain period of time or not? If it does, he's recorded as passing the suggestion. If he just sits there with his hand on his lap, that's a failed suggestion. And when we do that, what we get is a nice normal distribution of hypnotizability as measured by these various kinds of scales. These are the kinds of items that are very, very commonly used in these scales. These are the items from a scale developed many years ago at Stanford University that is basically the standard for the measurement of hypnotizability. And what you can see here is that this is a 12-point scale, and most subjects score in the low range of hypnotizability, more in the medium and high, some others in the medium and high range. And then we've got these individuals out here who kind of top out the scale. Those are the people we really like to have in our hypnosis experiments, who we call hypnotic virtuosos. Okay, so the kinds of phenomena I'm going to talk about today are not necessarily the kinds of experiences that just anybody can have in response to hypnotic suggestion. You got to be highly hypnotizable. Maybe not a virtuoso, but it's not your average person having these kinds of experiences. What I want to do mostly today is to focus on one phenomenon of hypnosis, which is particularly dramatic, particularly interesting, particularly subject to scientific investigation, and also particularly useful in the clinic, which is hypnotic analgesia. Suggest to the subject that he or she is not feeling pain from a stimulus that would ordinarily be painful. There are case reports of the use of hypnosis in major surgery as the sole analgesic agent. You don't do this unless you have to do it. Sometimes patients are allergic to chemical anesthetics, or there are other circumstances where you don't want to use chemical anesthetics. And if it turns out the patient is at least moderately hypnotizable, we now know from clinical studies, I'll show you one of these in a second, that about 1/3 to 1/2 of clinical patients can achieve significant pain relief through hypnosis alone. Not necessarily full pain relief, but if your physician told you that he could reduce the pain of a procedure by 50%, you take it, okay? You take that. Think about that the next time you're in the dentist chair, for example. Here is a recent meta-analysis by Guy Montgomery at University of Connecticut on the effectiveness of hypnotic analgesia. Effectiveness is measured in terms of effect size. It's a statistic that basically measures the size of the effect of experimental manipulation compared to control. In social, an effect size of 0.2 is generally thought of as a modest, small effect. Effect sizes of 0.4, 0.6 are thought of as modest kinds of effects. They're the kinds of effects that you typically see in social science research if you're really lucky. And what you see here is when hypnosis is used as an analgesic agent in the clinic, you get a very powerful effect size of about 0.8, maybe a little bit more. And that's also true in laboratory studies of pain relief. You get very, very, very powerful, effects. Here you can see the effect size plotted as a function of hypnotizability. And what you can see is if you're highly hypnotizable, not even a virtuoso, but just scoring relatively high on this scale, you're getting a whopping effect of hypnotic analgesia. Social scientists, oh hell, any scientist would kill for an effect size this high. It's a really terrific effect. Even if you're only moderately hypnotizable, you're getting a substantial effect of hypnotic analgesia. If you're insusceptible, as I say, it doesn't work for everybody. Here is a classic study by Hilgard. That's a psychophysical study of hypnotic analgesia, in which he applied a pain stimulus to subjects who were either hypnotized or not, varying levels of hypnotizability, and then he simply asked them to report how much pain they experienced on a standard magnitude estimation scale. This is how psychophysical studies have been done since the early 19th century. And what you can see here is that this is, this is cold pressor pain. This is a very nice laboratory analog of clinical pain, where you take the subject's forearm and you stick it in a bucket of circulating ice water. Cold pressor pain. You press the arm into this cold water, and very quickly the pain starts to mount. And this is a wonderful analog of clinical pain. If you've ever had stretched muscles or you've been in surgery or whatever, your surgical pain feels just like this. It's really terrific in that respect. And what we're seeing here is the subject's pain ratings after 60 seconds. And note that this is a pain rating on a 1 to 10 scale, okay? I'm sorry, 1 to 20 scale, where if you're insusceptible, hypnosis really doesn't do too much for you. You're getting the same pain ratings after 60 seconds, whether you're hypnotized or not. And that's true for these medium susceptible subjects too. But if you're at least moderately highly hypnotizable, you're getting a reduction of felt pain of about half. So that's what happens with cold pressor pain. Here is another study by John Stern and his associates at the Washington University in St. Louis. What Stern did, the same kind of a psychophysical study, except he compared the effectiveness of hypnosis to the effectiveness of a number of different pain treatments, acupuncture, and placebo acupuncture. That is, you put the needles in a point that's not an acupuncture point. These are subjects given morphine and aspirin, diazepam, which is a sedative, or placebo. This is an amazing experiment because every one of these subjects went through every one of these procedures, okay? And not only using cold pressor pain, but also using another pain stimulus known as ischemic muscle pain, where you put a blood pressure cuff around the person's upper arm, inflate it to restrict the flow of blood to the forearm, and then have the person engage in some kind of work. And what happens when you do that is the arm starts turning technicolor pretty fast, but you get this dull, throbbing, aching muscle pain that, again, is a really, really good clinical analog of pain. So these subjects did this under control conditions, placebo conditions, hypnosis, morphine, Darvon, all this, cold pressor, and ischemic muscle pain, 16 different trials for each subject. It's a kind of Spartan experiment that wouldn't necessarily want to do. And these are the basic results of the study. And what you can see is in this laboratory study, hypnosis gave these subjects more pain relief under these laboratory conditions for cold pressor pain than any of the other conditions, even morphine and true acupuncture. Here are the results for ischemic pain. You see the same result, hypnosis offering more pain relief than true acupuncture, morphine, or any of the other kinds of conditions. So this is a treatment that really does tend to work. But now you want to start being a little bit analytical about it. What is it that the hypnosis is really doing? We know, again, from psychophysical studies, that there are really two components to the pain experience. One, which we call sensory pain, which provides information about the location and the extent of an injury, and the other one, which is called suffering, which has more to